The cold wind howled through the empty streets as Malcolm Carter clutched a thin eviction notice in his trembling hands. His heart pounded against his ribs, his eyes scanning the bold red letters at the bottom of the page. His wife, Danielle, sat motionless on the torn living room couch, her face buried in her hands. The dim light barely illuminated their small apartment, an apartment that, by tomorrow morning, would no longer be theirs. Behind them, their two children, Jamal, 10, and Maya, 7, sat on the floor, confused and silent, watching their parents with fear in their eyes. They didn't understand the weight of the situation, but they could sense it. They could feel the despair in the air, thick like smoke, suffocating them. Malcolm clenched his fists, his mind racing. How did it come to this? He had done everything right. He worked 2 jobs, paid his rent on time, until the sudden rent hike made it impossible. The new housing law, disguised as a fair policy, had allowed landlords to increase rents beyond affordability, pushing out black families like his from neighborhoods they had lived in for years. And now he was being thrown out, just like so many others. 3 months earlier, Malcolm had walked into a leasing office, his credit score solid, his savings ready for a new place after their old landlord refused to renew their lease. He had spotted a clean, modest apartment in a better neighborhood, closer to his kids' school, a place where they could finally feel safe. But when he sat across from the leasing agent, a middle-aged white woman with a forced smile, everything changed. She barely glanced at his application before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but the unit is no longer available." Malcolm frowned. "But I just checked online. It was listed 5 minutes ago." The woman hesitated, then let out a small, almost pitying sigh. "We've had a policy change. We have to prioritize tenants who meet our community standards." Community standards. He had heard those words before. It was a coded phrase, a thinly veiled excuse. A racist housing law had given landlords the power to deny black tenants, hiding behind policies that sounded neutral on paper but targeted minorities in reality. Feeling the sting of humiliation, Malcolm stood up. As he turned to leave, he saw another man, a white man, walk in and ask about the same unit. "And the agent?" She smiled at him, handed him a clipboard, told him to fill out an application. Malcolm stopped at the door, staring in disbelief. He wanted to say something. He wanted to shout, but he knew, if he made a scene, he'd be the problem. He'd be the angry black man. So he walked away, gripping the rejected application in his hand like a crumpled dream. Back in the present, standing in his dark apartment, Malcolm let out a shaky breath. This wasn't just about him. It was about his family. Danielle finally lifted her head, her eyes red from crying. "Where are we supposed to go, Malcolm?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the pain behind it was deafening. Malcolm had no answer. They had applied everywhere, knocked on every door, but each rejection was the same, worded differently, delivered in different tones, but always with the same finality. His son, Jamal, finally spoke up. "Are we gonna be homeless?" Malcolm's chest tightened. He crouched down, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "No, son, we're gonna figure something out." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. Because this wasn't just bad luck. This was the system working exactly as it was designed to. A system that had kept black families in poverty for generations. A law that was never meant to help them, but to trap them. And Malcolm was done being trapped. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't just going to accept this. He wasn't just going to move in silence like so many before him. He was going to fight, even if the system was against him, even if the odds were stacked high, because if he didn't, his children would be next. Malcolm Carter had always believed in hard work. He had been raised by his grandfather, James Carter, a man who had fought tooth and nail to provide for his family, despite growing up in the Jim Crow era. James would always say, "A man's dignity is in his hands. Work hard, stay honest, and you'll make it." Malcolm had lived by those words. He worked 2 jobs, one as a warehouse supervisor during the day and another as a security guard at night. He had never missed a shift, never called in sick unless it was unavoidable. His wife, Danielle, worked part-time at a diner, juggling her hours with taking care of their kids. They weren't lazy, they weren't irresponsible. Yet, no matter how hard they worked, they were always one step away from disaster. And now, they had fallen off the edge. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Malcolm had graduated high school, even taken some college courses before financial struggles forced him to drop out. He had done everything right. So why did it feel like the system was designed to push him down rather than lift him up? The answer was staring him right in the face: redlining, discriminatory housing laws, predatory loans, and racist policies that had been in place for decades. His grandfather had been denied homeownership because of racist housing laws in the 1950s and 60s, forcing their family to rent instead of build generational wealth. His father had struggled with employment, constantly overlooked for promotions while his white colleagues moved up the ladder. And now, Malcolm was trapped in the same cycle, unable to break free. Landlords refused to rent to black families in certain neighborhoods, claiming they didn't meet the requirements. Banks denied home loans with higher interest rates for black applicants, making it nearly impossible to own property. Employers paid black workers less, offering fewer opportunities for advancement. Everywhere he turned, the system was rigged against him. Malcolm wasn't just fighting against one villain. He was up against an entire machine designed to keep black families in poverty. It started with the landlords who legally found ways to push out black tenants by raising rents beyond affordability. It extended to the banks that denied black families loans or approved them at predatory interest rates that made homeownership a financial noose. It continued with employers who refused to promote black workers, ensuring that generational wealth remained concentrated in white hands. And worst of all, it was the government policies, dressed up as neutral laws, that allowed all of this to happen under the pretense of economic growth and property rights. Malcolm felt powerless, but the anger inside him burned hotter than ever. He had worked too hard, struggled too much. He wasn't going to let his children inherit the same broken system. Something had to change. And if no one else was going to fight, then he would. And worst of all, it was the government policies, dressed up as neutral laws, that allowed all of this to happen under the pretense of economic growth and property rights. Malcolm felt powerless, but the anger inside him burned hotter than ever. He had worked too hard, struggled too much. He wasn't going to let his children inherit the same broken system. Something had to change. And if no one else was going to fight, then he would. Malcolm sat at the dining table, a stack of rejection letters spread in front of him. His wife, Danielle, stood nearby, arms crossed, her face tight with frustration. Their 2 children, Jaden, 10, and Amari, 7, sat in the living room, pretending not to listen. Another rejection. Another door slammed in his face. "This is the 3rd apartment that's turned us down," Danielle said, her voice trembling with anger. "What's their excuse this time?" Malcolm sighed, rubbing his temples. "They said our credit score wasn't high enough." Danielle scoffed. "We pay our rent on time every month. We don't have any debt, but somehow we're still not qualified?" Malcolm clenched his fists. He had saved for years, hoping to finally move his family into a safer neighborhood. But every bank, every landlord found a reason to say no. Desperate, Malcolm decided to apply for a home loan. He had seen ads for first-time homebuyer programs, claiming to help working-class families. Maybe, just maybe, this was their chance. He sat in the office of Mr. Lawson, a middle-aged white banker who barely looked up from his computer screen. "Mr. Carter," Lawson finally said, scanning the documents, "you have a steady income, but your loan application has been denied." Malcolm's stomach dropped. "Why?" Lawson leaned back, adjusting his tie. "Your credit score is borderline, and properties in the area you applied for are in high demand. We have to prioritize applicants with stronger financial standing." Malcolm gritted his teeth. Another excuse, another lie. He had researched the area. White applicants with lower credit scores had been approved. He knew because he had spoken to some of them. "Sir," Malcolm said, keeping his voice steady, "is my credit score really the problem? Or is it the fact that I'm a black man trying to move into a predominantly white neighborhood?" Lawson's expression froze for a moment before he forced a smile. "I'm afraid I can't comment on that." Malcolm stood up, his hands trembling. This wasn't about credit. This was redlining. This was discrimination. And no one cared. With his dream of buying a home crushed, Malcolm focused on getting a better job. His boss at the warehouse, Mr. Harper, had promised him a promotion months ago. He had worked there for 7 years, never once missing a shift. Moi! But when the list of promotions was posted, his name wasn't on it. Instead, a younger white worker, Todd, had been promoted, despite having less experience. Malcolm stormed into Harper's office. "Sir, I thought I was next in line for that position." Harper sighed, shaking his head. "Look, Malcolm, you're a hard worker, but we decided to go in a different direction." Malcolm's fists clenched. "A different direction?" "With all due respect, I've been here longer. I've trained Todd myself." Harper shrugged. "It's just business." Malcolm felt his stomach turn. How many times had his father heard those words? How many times had his grandfather? So, it was never about hard work. It was about keeping people like him in their place. The final betrayal came 2 weeks later. Malcolm was called into Harper's office again. "We have to let you go," Harper said, avoiding eye contact. "Let me go? What did I do?" Malcolm demanded. Harper sighed, pretending to be sympathetic. "Budget cuts. You understand." Malcolm saw the truth in Harper's eyes. Todd kept his job. White workers kept their jobs, but he was cut to make room. Malcolm sat in his car, staring at the eviction notice in his hands. No job, no loan, no way out. His landlord, Mr. Reynolds, had wasted no time. "You're already behind on rent," he had sneered. "Can't afford it? Find somewhere else." But there was nowhere else. Every apartment rejected him. Every bank denied him. Every employer ignored him. He had done everything right, and yet the system kept closing in on him, just like it had for generations. Danielle's voice shook with fear. "Malcolm, what are we going to do?" Malcolm stared at the eviction notice, his hands trembling. Something snapped inside him. "This isn't just happening to us," he whispered. "It's happening to thousands of families. It's been happening for decades." Danielle's eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Malcolm growled, his voice filled with anger and determination, "I'm done playing by their rules, and it's time to fight back." Malcolm sat in his car outside their apartment building, staring at the eviction notice for what felt like the 100th time. The paper was crumpled from how many times he had clenched it in frustration. 30 days. That's all they had before he, Danielle, and their 2 kids would be out on the streets. Danielle sat beside him, her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. "I checked with my sister," she said quietly. "She can let me and the kids stay for a while, but she doesn't have space for all of us." Malcolm exhaled, his heart sinking. They were being torn apart. His phone buzzed. A final rejection email from another job application. He had no home, no job, and no way out. Malcolm took a deep breath and started driving. He didn't tell Danielle where he was going because he wasn't sure himself. All he knew was that he had to do something. He parked outside the local legal aid center, staring up at the worn-down building. He had never considered going there before. What could they do against an entire system built to keep him down? But he had no other options. Inside, the small waiting room was packed with people, mostly Black and Latino families, all holding eviction notices, debt collections, or unfair termination papers. The faces were different, but their pain was the same. A receptionist glanced up. "You need help?" Malcolm hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." She handed him a clipboard. "Fill this out. Someone will be with you soon." An hour later, Malcolm sat across from Lisa Brooks, a civil rights lawyer in her early 40s. She was sharp-eyed, serious, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had fought too many battles to waste time on pleasantries. She scanned his eviction notice and shook her head. "This is illegal." Malcolm's eyes widened. "What?" Lisa tapped the paper. "Your landlord is trying to force you out without proper notice. That's a violation of tenant protection laws. He's banking on the fact that most tenants don't fight back." Malcolm clenched his fists. "Because we don't have the money for lawyers." Lisa leaned forward. "That's why I'm here. I take cases like yours for free." For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt something he thought had disappeared completely. Hope. "But listen," Lisa continued, her tone firm. "Fighting an eviction is one thing. But this isn't just about one landlord. This is about a system that has been designed to keep Black families from building wealth. You're caught in something much bigger." Malcolm swallowed hard. "I know, but what can I do?" Lisa studied him for a moment. "We start by keeping you in your home. If we win this case, it could set a precedent for other families in your situation." Malcolm exhaled. A small win, a chance to fight back. With Lisa's help, Malcolm filed a lawsuit against his landlord. The news spread quickly, a Black tenant taking on an unjust eviction in court. A local journalist, Daniel Reed, heard about the case and called Malcolm. "I run a column on housing discrimination," he explained. "Would you be willing to share your story?" Malcolm hesitated. Speaking out could bring backlash, but he had nothing left to lose. Days later, an article appeared in the local paper. "The Invisible Red Line: How Black Families Are Still Denied Housing." For the first time, Malcolm wasn't just a victim, he was a voice. At the hearing, Lisa stood confidently before the judge, laying out the evidence of illegal eviction. The landlord's lawyer squirmed under the pressure, stammering through weak excuses. In the end, the judge ruled in Malcolm's favor. For now, his family could stay in their home. Danielle hugged him tight, tears in her eyes. Jaden and Amari cheered, and they had won a battle, but the war was far from over. A week later, Malcolm received a notice in the mail. His landlord had decided not to renew their lease. Danielle's face fell as she read the paper. "So, that's it? We won, and now they're just kicking us out another way?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. The system never gave up. Lisa wasn't surprised. "They're finding loopholes to push you out. This is exactly why housing discrimination is so hard to fight." Malcolm exhaled. "So what do we do now?" Lisa folded her arms. "We go bigger." That night, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the comments on Daniel Reed's article. People were angry, outraged. "This is modern-day redlining. We need to expose these banks and landlords. How many families has this happened to?" And then he saw it. A petition had been started demanding an investigation into housing discrimination in their city. Thousands had signed it. Malcolm stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was bigger than him. And he wasn't done fighting. People were angry, outraged. "This is modern-day redlining. We need to expose these banks and landlords. How many families has this happened to?" And then he saw it. A petition had been started demanding an investigation into housing discrimination in their city. Thousands had signed it. Malcolm stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was bigger than him. And he wasn't done fighting. Malcolm sat in his apartment, staring at his laptop screen. The petition against housing discrimination had gained over 50,000 signatures. News stations had started picking up the story. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from activists, journalists, and struggling families who saw him as a symbol of hope. For the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt like things were finally turning around. Danielle, however, was still cautious. "This fight isn't over," she reminded him as she tucked their kids into bed. "You know they're not just going to let this slide." Malcolm exhaled. He knew she was right. The system had never been fair to people like them, and when black people fought back, the system fought harder. One evening, Malcolm received a phone call from a well-dressed man claiming to be a real estate investor. "I've been following your story," the man, Robert Hayes, said in a smooth, businesslike tone. "I admire what you're doing, but you're fighting a losing battle. I have a solution." Malcolm hesitated. "What kind of solution?" "I can offer you a home, a fresh start. My company specializes in affordable housing. I want to help." Malcolm's gut told him something was off, but desperation clouded his judgment. He agreed to meet. A few days later, Malcolm sat across from Hayes in a sleek office downtown. The offer sounded too good to be true. A mortgage deal with low interest rates and no hidden fees, an opportunity to finally own a home. Hayes slid a contract across the desk. "Just sign, and you'll be on your way to financial security." Malcolm hesitated. His fingers hovered over the pen. This was it, a chance to finally break free. But something gnawed at him. He glanced over the fine print. Predatory lending terms, hidden fees, adjustable interest rates that could skyrocket. It was a trap. "This isn't a fair deal," Malcolm said, pushing the contract back. Hayes smiled, but his eyes darkened. "You don't really have a choice." "What's that supposed to mean?" Hayes leaned in, lowering his voice. "The people in power don't like troublemakers, Malcolm. If you walk away, things could get difficult for you." Malcolm's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about housing. This was about silencing him. He stood up. "I'm not signing." Hayes sighed, shaking his head. "Your funeral." The very next day, Malcolm was walking back to his apartment when he noticed something strange. 2 police cars were parked outside. A crowd had gathered. Danielle was standing on the steps, her face pale, holding their 2 kids close. "What's going on?" Malcolm rushed forward. A uniformed officer blocked his path. "Malcolm Davis, you're under arrest." Malcolm froze. "For what?" The officer turned him around and slapped handcuffs on his wrists. "Fraud and trespassing," the cop said. "Your landlord filed charges against you. Says you forged documents to stay in the apartment illegally." Malcolm's head spun. This was a setup. He turned to Danielle, who was crying. Their children clung to her, terrified. "You can't do this," Malcolm shouted. "This is a lie." The officer shoved him into the back of the police car. As the door slammed shut, Malcolm saw his landlord standing on the sidewalk smirking. Next to him, Robert Hayes stood watching, adjusting his cufflinks. The system had played its hand. Malcolm sat in a cold jail cell, staring at the wall. Everything had been ripped away in an instant. His family had nowhere to go. His case was now plastered all over the news, but this time not as a hero. Local activist arrested for housing fraud. Was Malcolm Davis lying all along? Community leader exposed as a criminal. They had flipped the narrative, turned him into the villain. Lisa came to see him the next morning. "They played you," she said, anger burning in her eyes. "They knew you wouldn't take the deal, so they set you up." Malcolm clenched his fists. "What do I do now?" Lisa exhaled. "We fight, but this won't be easy." Malcolm looked down at his shackled wrists. The system wanted to break him, and they just might succeed. Malcolm sat in the dimly lit jail cell, his thoughts racing. The cold metal bench beneath him did nothing to numb the pain of betrayal, of being reduced to a criminal in the eyes of the world. His mind replayed the look of horror on Danielle's face, the fear in his children's eyes. He had been fighting for justice, but now the system had turned him into an example, a warning to others who dared to challenge it. Lisa's words echoed in his mind. We fight, but this won't be easy. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if they had won? What if there was no way out? Then something inside him snapped. No, they wouldn't win. He wouldn't let them. Lisa worked quickly. While Malcolm sat in a jail cell, she took the fight to the people. She called journalists, activists, and lawyers, anyone who would listen. But most doors slammed shut. The media had already painted Malcolm as a fraud. So Lisa turned to social media. She posted the truth. The corrupt landlord, the fake fraud charges, the setup. She uploaded videos of Malcolm's past speeches, clips of landlords denying black families housing, and interviews with victims of the same racist policies. Then she posted the video Malcolm had recorded before his arrest, a warning that something like this might happen. This is what happens when you challenge the system, Malcolm's voice echoed through the screen. They silence you, they take everything, but I won't stop fighting. The video went viral. Millions watched. The hashtags #FreeMalcolm and #HousingJustice now started trending. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people demanded Malcolm's release. The pressure mounted. Malcolm sat in the courtroom, his wrists still shackled. Across from him, his landlord, Robert Hayes, and their expensive lawyers smirked with confidence. The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, this man is a fraud. He illegally forged documents to steal housing. Lisa interrupted, standing beside Malcolm. Your Honor, that is a lie, and we have proof. She turned to the audience. This case isn't about fraud. This is about power, about a system designed to keep black families in poverty. She laid out evidence of discrimination, emails, hidden clauses in contracts, proof that landlords deliberately blocked black tenants. Then she played the video of Malcolm's wrongful arrest. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm sat still, his heart pounding. This was it. The judge studied the evidence, his expression unreadable. Minutes felt like hours. Then, finally, charges dismissed. Malcolm Davis is free to go. Victory. But at what cost? The courtroom erupted in cheers. Malcolm turned to Lisa, his eyes burning with gratitude. He had won, but the fight wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, the streets were packed with supporters. Signs reading "Justice for Black Tenants" and "End Racist Housing Laws" filled the air. A journalist shoved a microphone toward Malcolm. What's next? Malcolm took a deep breath. The system tried to break me, he said. But I am not broken, and I am not done. The war had just begun. Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the battle still pressing on his shoulders. The sun shone brightly, but it did little to warm the cold reality of what had just happened. Yes, he was free. Yes, the fraudulent charges were dropped. But the racist housing law? Still standing. The people in power? Still untouchable. As he scanned the crowd, he saw Danielle holding their children, tears glistening in her eyes. They had fought so hard just to survive. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder. They gave you back your freedom, but they didn't give back what they stole. Malcolm nodded. The fight wasn't over. The crowd quieted as Malcolm stepped onto the courthouse steps. Reporters shoved microphones toward him, cameras flashing. This was his moment. He took a deep breath. They tried to bury me, he began. They thought if they locked me up, the truth would disappear. But they were wrong. His voice grew stronger. This is bigger than me. This is about every black family denied a home, every child forced to grow up in poverty, every dream stolen by a system that was never built for us. The crowd erupted in agreement. Malcolm pointed toward the courthouse. They dropped my charges, but they never admitted their crime, and as long as these racist laws exist, none of us are free. A pause, then a challenge. We march, we organize, we fight, not just for me, but for every family still trapped in this system. The system's response. A sinister warning. As Malcolm spoke, inside the courthouse, powerful men watched in silence. Robert Hayes, the corrupt landlord, stood by the window, his jaw clenched. He hadn't lost. Not really. Beside him, a well-dressed senator took a slow sip of his coffee. He's got a voice. That makes him dangerous. Hayes scoffed. He's a man who just got lucky. We'll handle him. The senator smirked. We always do. The final blow. A call in the night. That night, Malcolm sat in his small apartment, exhaustion weighing on him. His children slept peacefully in the next room. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello? A voice, calm and collected. You're making powerful enemies, Mr. Davis? Malcolm's grip tightened. Who is this? A pause, then a chilling response. A reminder. You may have won today, but don't forget, the system always wins. Click. Silence. The cliffhanger. A war yet to be fought. Malcolm sat still, the weight of those words sinking in. He had won a battle, but the war, it was just beginning. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. And Malcolm? He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The end. But the fight continues. Silence. The cliffhanger. A war yet to be fought. Malcolm sat still, the weight of those words sinking in. He had won a battle, but the war, it was just beginning. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. And Malcolm? He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The end. But the fight continues.